This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
For more than 35 years, Capcom's Makaimura series has managed to persist. It may not have had the number of installments as Mega Man or Street Fighter, but the series has remained a key part of Capcom's history. And now, with the original director at the helm once more, it has returned with Ghosts and Goblins: Resurrection for the Nintendo Switch. At its core, this new game is a brutal return to form, delivering an experience that builds upon the original games in new and interesting ways. It's both a love letter to those first titles, and a brand new experience that stands on its own. It's also one of the first Switch games built using Capcom's excellent RE engine, the other being Monster Hunter Rise. While very different, Ghosts and Goblins showcases just how flexible the tools and technology can be. So today we'll touch upon the history of the series, compare the latest installment to the original games, and discuss the technical details, including, of course, performance. So, with that said, let us commence. Released in 1985, the original Ghosts and Goblins first appeared in arcades just as the platform game was taking shape. This is the same year Nintendo released the original Super Mario Bros. And a year or so after Namco's Pac-Land. It is a foundational game for the platforming genre. Its custom arcade hardware allowed for beautiful, haunting visuals with plenty of sprites on screen, but it was perhaps the difficulty that it became best known for. It was a success and of course received a huge number of conversions, many of which are of relatively poor quality, but they were still popular. The second game, Ghouls and Ghosts, was built around a new platform, however, Capcom's CPS-1 hardware, enabling some of the finest 2D visuals the world had seen in a side-scrolling action game. This is the breakout game for the series, and in my opinion, the very best installment. The action is fast and smooth, the visuals ridiculously detailed, and the control is simply perfect. It too received a wide range of conversions, including an excellent Sega Mega Drive version programmed by Yuji Naka, not to mention an even more impressive release on NEC's ill-fated Super Graphics. This was followed up with a home console sequel on Super NES, Super Ghouls and Ghosts. It boasts beautiful visuals and a haunting soundtrack along with some exceptional level design, but was plagued by severe slowdown, something the community has fixed decades later via a patch. By this point, the series was successful enough that many spin-offs were produced, including 2 Gargoyles Quest games based on the Red Armor character, the remarkable Demon's Crest on Super NES, which is a sequel to those games, a Wonder Swan installment, and even a puzzle game based on The Incredible Machine. The series even received 2 3D installments on PlayStation 2 courtesy of Capcom Digital Studio, a Western-based subsidiary. Known as Maximo, these 2 games were well received at the time and really brought the series back into the limelight, though really it never fully left, as Arthur would appear in various other Capcom games. In 2006, Capcom even released a brand new installment for the PSP, Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins. It's an interesting though flawed installment, though it did receive a Japanese exclusive update known as Goku Makaimura Kai, which improves upon the design of the original release. And the man behind these main installments, as you may know, is one Tokuro Fujiwara, who just happens to have returned as the director for this brand new game on Switch. Fujiwara himself made a name at Capcom as one of their original game creators. He directed and produced a huge number of games at Capcom starting in the early 80s. He's one of the most influential figures of his era. But he eventually left Capcom, founding Whoopee Camp, where he directed the Tomba games for the original PlayStation, both of which are excellent. He continued to work on other games before returning to Capcom to direct the PSP installment. His last real credited work then was Platinum's Mad World. But now, Fujiwara has returned to direct Ghosts and Goblins: Resurrection, even bringing back the Whoopee Camp name as evidenced in the credits. So by now, hopefully this brief rundown has given you an idea of both what the series has offered to players in the past and Fujiwara's history. So the question is, does it still have the magic? Well, we'll answer that question in due time, but as a Digital Foundry video, I want to begin with the technical details for this game. As noted earlier, this is one of the first Switch titles to have been developed using the RE engine, which first appeared in Resident Evil 7. It's an unexpected use for the engine, however, as the team has adopted a two-dimensional storybook-style design. It's something that really grew on me as I played the game, but it can appear somewhat unusual at first glance. Unlike other modern games competing in the 2D space, however, such as the Ori titles, Ghosts 'n Goblins looks a little bit different. It mainly comes down to the presentation of the different layers. Ori, for instance, relies on very soft, alpha-transparent edges along the scenery, but the various layers used in this new game, however, are much sharper, but also more aliased. It certainly lends the game a rather different look from other 2D titles such as the aforementioned Ori or something like Cuphead. And it also makes revealing the resolution rather easy. When docked, the artwork is displayed at a fixed 1080p resolution, while portable mode drops to 720p instead. For the Switch hardware, this is a rather aggressive target, as we'll see soon enough, but it does at least look relatively crisp. There is of course no anti-aliasing applied to any of the edges, which in this case kinda works in its favor, I think. You see, these visible edges result in something that feel more like a hybrid of 2D and 3D, but really it looks great overall. Each stage features significant depth in the parallax scrolling with many overlapping layers. The scenery itself is highly dynamic as well. Some of these concepts were first featured in other games. For instance, in Ghouls 'n Ghosts, the blowing trees appears here as well, though with more detail. But this new thing goes much further, with stages that break apart as you progress, leading to an unexpected shift in design. It's this flexibility that allows for some of the most ambitious level design in the series' history, while still building off what makes the original games so good. So, with this section then, I'd like to compare some of the level designs between the original arcade releases and this new game. Of course, when you first start the game, you're presented with this screen. You can choose from one of two stages at the beginning, something you'll be able to do in the following two stages as well. The overall game is still linear, but you have a choice between levels at various junctions in the game, and you can replay any of them. There are collectibles, for instance, which allow you to power up your magic attacks. But for this comparison, let's begin with these first two stages. The top one begins in a cemetery, just like the original 1985 arcade game. You'll recognize key moments and enemies as you play through this level, but they are completely remixed and redesigned. Both games begin in this sort of wide open space consisting of gravestones and grassy terrain. You'll have to deal with an undead army as they arise from the ground, before eventually arriving at a two-tiered section with ladders connecting the two pieces together. After this point, however, there's a brand new section which differs completely from the original arcade release, before reconnecting with that design when you meet Red Arima. Just like the original, he can be a pain to deal with, but this time you can't just kill him with your normal weapon. When you make it past him, however, his section ends with the same moving platform above the water. Then you have these flying enemies to contend with before eventually arriving at a boss battle. Everything is inspired by the original, but it's all fleshed out and significantly more interesting design-wise. The stage is roughly 2 to 3 times as long as the original game. The same is true of the alternative first stage, which is derived from the sequel Ghouls 'n Ghosts. This opens with the same blue-cloaked skeletons, guillotines, and castle ruins. Halfway through the stage then, the weather picks up just as it did in the arcade original, leading to a beautiful visual effect as you dodge enemies caught in the storm. Further sections continue to build upon familiarity, but with new layouts and concepts including these cages, but you eventually arrive at the big boss, which once again takes things much further while directly calling back to the design of the second game. I love the way the game takes something familiar, then turns it on its head. You'll find that this is true throughout many sections of the game, and I feel it's a fantastic way to approach level design. It's all mostly new in terms of the actual layout, and there's a lot of cool, interesting sections as well, but it really calls back to the classic games, and it looks beautiful while doing it. In addition, the control system itself seems to be based more on the second game. That means there's no double jumping, but you do get multi-directional attacks. As always, Arthur is a character that requires commitment though. The timing of every jump is crucial to success, and it feels just as rewarding learning the game. This is really key to what makes this series so difficult. The controls themselves combined with the often random appearance of enemies. You can't just memorize certain patterns, you really have to learn to deal with the constant onslaught of enemies. But okay, it's time to talk about the animation. I think this is perhaps the most divisive element with this game. Essentially, characters animate almost like puppets, with tweened limbs flopping about as you run. I believe this style of animation is where comments suggesting it looks like a Flash game are coming from, and I get it. The concept is similar on the surface. However, I feel that's really selling the animation work here short. It's different, sure, but if you look at things like, say, Arthur's run cycle, I think it matches up nicely against the prior games. Alas, while it did grow on me, it's clearly one of those things that just isn't going to work for everyone. The same goes for the control as well. It's certainly responsive enough, but the style of animation combined with the slow movement speed is also proving rather divisive. Personally, I've never had an issue with games that are perhaps over-animated. It's one of the reasons I still love titles like Pitfall the Mayan Adventure and Earthworm Jim. But your mileage will certainly vary. Just something to keep in mind. There are some interesting uses of the RE engine technology as well. In this stage, for instance, dynamic lighting enables more dramatic effects. Players are tasked with extinguishing candles to bypass, as they are hazardous to your health. But when doing so, you put out the dynamic light that makes it possible to see enemies. If you look closely, you'll still spot them through the darkness, but it's an interesting dynamic as you kind of go back and forth between darkened and lit areas. Another advantage of this approach to visuals can be found in the camera work itself. Essentially, the camera can zoom in or out depending on the scene, leading to a very dynamic side view of the action. It looks really excellent in motion and works without any sort of shimmering or artifacts. In fact, it's so subtle that you might not even notice it at first, but it definitely opens up the playfield. Okay though, hopefully by now you have a pretty good idea of how the game looks and plays. But equally important to this is of course the frame rate. And this is a weird one, as the series hasn't always been known for smooth frame rates. Sure, the second game in the series is extremely smooth, but the Super NES game was often very slow, while the PSP title was capped at just 30 frames per second. With this new Switch game, however, 60 frames per second is the target, as it should be, but it's not without flaws. Now, by and large, it does manage to reach the target frame rate, the vast majority of the time at least, but it's certainly not 100% stable. Here's what you can expect from a typical run of play. You might notice that frames are dropped at various points during gameplay, but it does mostly manage to reach the target frame rate, which is key. There are, however, specific areas where the performance really suffers, and I'm going to highlight them right now. Curiously, one of the more egregious examples occurs right away. In fact, my first impression of the game was somewhat negative as a result of this. The very first stage in the game begins with a section where the frame rate dips below 60 FPS. As you can imagine, this was slightly concerning. I figured, as this is the first stage, the average frame rate would only become worse as you played. Thankfully, that's not the case, and the specific section is weirdly heavier than average, perhaps due to the large number of enemies. Now, the alternate first stage fares a lot better out of the gate, but there are still various points where the performance dips. The worst case in this stage is evident during the stormy section, where we see a sustained drop to around 50 frames per second until you pass this area. The other major dip I noted occurs right at the beginning of the second stage. The alpha transparency effects used here tanks the frame rate for a brief moment, before jumping back up to 60 FPS, which is how most of the stage plays out. These 3 sections are perhaps the worst in the game, but it's still disappointing to see. Fortunately, most other areas throughout are smoother, bordering on perfect even, so it's not a tremendously huge problem, but it definitely upholds the series' tradition in regards to performance. It should be noted that unlike the Super NES game, this title works like any other modern game where it simply skips frames, so when the frame rate does drop, it doesn't actually run in slow motion. Portable mode, though, is more interesting. The lower resolution helps mitigate most of the performance issues I mentioned earlier. The smaller dips are now mostly eliminated, and the overall game is just smoother on average. Even the windy section, which does still slow down, manages to avoid dropping to the same degree as it does in docked mode. This suggests that the docked mode resolution is perhaps just a little too high for the Switch then, but at the same time, due to the nature of the artwork, I can see why it was decided to maintain 1080p output. 900p may have improved the performance, but it would have impacted the art design significantly. Perhaps overclocking the Switch could help here. I haven't hacked my Switch, so I can't say for sure, but it is something to consider. The other performance metric we can discuss though is loading times, but this is pretty much just to confirm that they are relatively brief and inoffensive. Most importantly, you restart quickly upon death. I only mention this as long loading times could have spelled disaster for the game due to how often you're likely to die while learning it. So overall then, Resurrection is an interesting release. The RE engine performs well on the Switch, but at the same time it does feel like a slight step down from Mega Man 11 in terms of overall consistency. At least the presentation is absolutely beautiful, though at the same time it's somewhat divisive. This is also true of the game itself. I know some fans have been disappointed by the game, while others, such as myself, absolutely love it. I still prefer the second arcade game, and perhaps even the Super NES game, but I feel that this is an exceptionally solid entry. The team clearly understands the basics of these games, and delivers an exceptional set of stages and bosses to play through. In fact, the boss encounters are probably the best we've ever seen in this series. It's also worth noting that the game has 4 difficulty options. It is a very, very difficult game on the higher settings, but it's possible to scale it down in a way that most people should be able to have a lot of fun with it. So while it's not perfect, I feel that this is a game that stands proudly next to the likes of Bionic Commando Rearmed and Mega Man 11 and how it brings a classic franchise back on modern platforms. It's very difficult, but also very rewarding, and I know I'll be playing and replaying it over the coming weeks. But that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to let us know. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, you know the drill. And until next time, this is John, signing off.
Finally, a headset that can be as expressive as you. G733 is wireless and designed for comfort, and it's outfitted with all the surround sound, voice filters and advanced lighting you need to look, sound and play with more style than ever. Lightspeed Wireless technology lets you game wirelessly without compromises in latency, connectivity or battery. Play in complete freedom with over 20 hours of battery life and a range of up to 15 meters.